Picture a quiet October morning in 1943, the sun barely rising over the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The USS Eldridge, a Navy destroyer, sits docked, its crew preparing for what they believe is just another routine experiment. But this was no ordinary test. Within moments, the ship is enveloped in a bizarre green-blue haze, and then, inexplicably, it vanishes, not just from sight, but from existence itself. When it reappears minutes later, the crew is in shambles. Some are fused into the bulkheads, others are driven to madness, and a few simply aren't human anymore. This is the chilling legend of the Philadelphia experiment, a story that has haunted the fringes of science and conspiracy for over 80 years. Was it a top-secret military project gone horribly wrong, a breakthrough in invisibility technology, or something far darker, something the government has been desperate to bury? The tale of the USS Eldridge is more than just a ghost story. It's a puzzle wrapped in layers of deception, eyewitness accounts, and classified documents. Officially, the Navy denies it ever happened, but the whispers persist. Sailors who claim to have seen the ship blink out of existence. Scientists who hint at experiments with Einstein's unified field theory, bending the very fabric of reality. Even government insiders who have slipped fragments of the truth only to vanish themselves. The Philadelphia experiment isn't just about a ship, it's about the terrifying possibilities of what humanity might have unlocked and lost. So what really happened that day? Did the military stumble upon a way to manipulate time and space, only to bury the evidence when things spiraled out of control? Or is the truth even stranger, tied to forces we still don't understand? Tonight, we're diving deep into the mysteries of the Philadelphia experiment, peeling back decades of myth and secrecy to uncover what might have taken place. From the shredded official records to the eerie first-hand testimonies, we'll piece together the clues and ask the question no one's been able to fully answer. What were the real outcomes of the Philadelphia experiment? Buckle up, because by the end of this journey, you might just question everything you think you know about science, secrecy, and the limits of human ambition. The roots of the Philadelphia experiment stretch back to the feverish scientific climate of World War II, when nations raced to develop technologies that could turn the tide of battle. Among the most tantalizing ideas was the concept of invisibility, not just camouflage, but making entire ships vanish from enemy radar and sight. Declassified documents reveal the U.S. Navy's Project Rainbow, a clandestine initiative exploring electromagnetic fields to bend light around objects, but whispers suggest the goals were far more radical. Some accounts claim scientists weren't just trying to hide ships, they were attempting to teleport them across space, even time. At the heart of these rumors stand two towering figures, Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein. Tesla, the eccentric genius whose work on high-frequency energy allegedly laid the groundwork, reportedly collaborated with the Navy before his mysterious death in 1943, just as the Eldridge experiments began. His unpublished papers on dynamic ether theory vanished into government vaults. Einstein, meanwhile, was deeply involved in military research during the war. His unified field theory, an attempt to merge electromagnetism and gravity, may have been weaponized in ways he never intended. Witnesses later claimed they saw equations from his notebooks scrawled across blackboards in the Eldridge's control room. Why would the military risk such an experiment? The answer lies in the desperate calculus of war. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships at an alarming rate. If a destroyer could be rendered invisible, or better yet, instantly relocated, it could strike without warning. But the science was unstable, the consequences unknown. Researchers reportedly warned of dimensional fractures and temporal displacement, terms that sound like science fiction until you hear the testimonies. Engineers who worked on the project described a machine called the zero-point energy generator, capable of warping space-time. When activated during a test in July 1943, spectators allegedly saw the Eldridge flicker like a mirage before briefly disappearing, a horrifying preview of what would happen 3 months later. Yet for all these ominous clues, the Navy maintains none of it ever occurred. No records of Project Rainbow survive, if they existed at all. Einstein's family denied his involvement, and Tesla's final days remain shrouded in rumor. But the persistence of the story from sailors who swore under oath to physicists who leaked fragments of equations suggests something extraordinary was attempted. Whether it was groundbreaking science or catastrophic hubris, one thing is certain: the Philadelphia experiment wasn't born from idle speculation. It emerged from a world at war where the line between miracle and nightmare was thinner than ever. The USS Eldridge was a Cannon-class destroyer escort, a workhorse of the U.S. Navy designed for anti-submarine warfare during World War II. Officially commissioned in August 1943, its records show a standard career escorting supply convoys across the Atlantic, hunting German U-boats, and undergoing routine maintenance at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. But behind these dry logbook entries lies a far more unsettling story. Conspiracy theorists point to glaring inconsistencies in the Eldridge's deployment history. For a ship supposedly active in the Mediterranean by early 1944, there are unexplained gaps in its movement, reports weeks where it seemingly vanished from all tracking systems. Even more bizarre, some crew manifests list sailors who don't appear in any other Navy records, as if their identities were erased. At the heart of the mystery is the Eldridge's crew. Survivors who later came forward described an atmosphere of paranoia and secrecy aboard the ship long before its infamous October experiment. Engineers were allegedly sworn to silence about modifications made below deck, including the installation of massive electromagnetic coils and a shielded chamber referred to only as the resonator. One electrician's journal, leaked decades later, spoke of being ordered to calibrate equipment that emitted a high-pitched whine, followed by sudden temperature drops and a vibrating haze in the air. These accounts clash starkly with the Navy's official stance that the Eldridge was a conventional warship with no special modifications. The most damning discrepancies emerge when cross-referencing dates. While Navy archives place the Eldridge in Norfolk, Virginia, during the alleged October experiment, independent researchers uncovered weather reports and harbor master logs from Philadelphia describing an unscheduled electrical disturbance near the exact time of the vanishing incident. Even more chilling are the personnel files. Several crewmen listed as transferred off the Eldridge in September 1943 later turned up in psychiatric hospitals, their medical charts citing acute radiation exposure and temporal disorientation, conditions unheard of in ordinary naval service. One sailor's family preserved his frantic letters, which described being pulled through walls and seeing men walking into bulkheads without stopping. So why would the Navy go to such lengths to obscure the truth? Some researchers argue the Eldridge was a pawn in a far larger game. Declassified memos from the Office of Naval Research hint at post-war attempts to replicate electromagnetic masking technology, suggesting the experiment wasn't an isolated event but part of a continuing program. Others believe the ship's crew stumbled into a phenomenon science still can't explain, a rift in space-time that defied containment. Whatever the case, the USS Eldridge remains both a tangible relic and an enduring enigma. Today, its name is etched not just in naval archives, but in the annals of the unexplained, a ghost ship caught between history and legend. The story of the Philadelphia experiment might have faded into obscurity if not for one enigmatic figure, Carlos Allende. In the late 1950s, this itinerant merchant marine began sending handwritten letters to astronomer and writer Morris Jessup, detailing horrifying events he claimed to have witnessed firsthand. What made Allende's account so compelling wasn't just the vividness of his descriptions, it was the eerie specificity. He spoke of the Eldridge's crew screaming as they phased in and out of visibility, of men freezing mid-air before crumbling into ash. He even named scientists involved, some of whom matched real military researchers. But Allende wasn't just an observer. He insisted he'd been aboard the nearby SS Andrew Furuseth when the experiment unfolded, watching in terror as the Eldridge flickered between dimensions. Yet Allende's credibility unraveled under scrutiny. His letters, scrawled in a chaotic mix of cursive and block letters, were riddled with inconsistencies. He alternately claimed to hold advanced degrees in physics and admitted to being a drifter. His language swung between technical jargon and near-incoherent rambling, referencing obscure scientific theories alongside paranoid rants about government assassins. Skeptics noted his obsession with Jessup's work on anti-gravity, suggesting Allende crafted his tale to mirror the astronomer's interests, even more damning. No crew records from the Andrew Furuseth place him aboard during the alleged incident, but here's where things get stranger. In 1955, the Office of Naval Research received a copy of Jessup's book The Case for the UFO, annotated with cryptic notes echoing Allende's claims. The handwriting matched no known associate of Jessup, yet the margin scribbles referenced classified projects by name. When pressed, Allende alternately took credit and denied involvement, once boasting he'd ghostwritten the annotations under hypnosis. This bizarre twist deepened the mystery. Was he a gifted hoaxer playing an elaborate game, or a damaged witness stumbling onto something real? Psychologists who later analyzed Allende's letters noted signs of possible schizophrenia, delusions of grandeur, disjointed thought patterns. Yet amid the chaos were peculiar accuracies. He correctly described the Eldridge's experimental degaussing system, a method used to shield ships from magnetic mines. He also named physicist John von Neumann as a project consultant, a claim dismissed until declassified files confirmed von Neumann's secret work on electromagnetic weapons. These tantalizing breadcrumbs keep researchers divided. Could Allende have pieced together facts from overheard naval gossip? Or did he, as some theorists suggest, genuinely experience something that fractured his grasp on reality? By the time Jessup died under suspicious circumstances in 1959, ruled a suicide but plagued by irregularities, Allende had vanished into the American Southwest, leaving behind a trail of contradictory interviews. In one, he recounted everything, calling the story a sea tale gone wild. In another, he whispered of government agents erasing evidence. Whatever the truth, Allende's role remains pivotal. He was either the chaotic architect of history's most enduring naval hoax, or the fractured mirror reflecting a truth too terrible to face. And that duality is what makes the Philadelphia experiment endure. Because in the end, the question isn't just whether the Eldridge disappeared, but whether we'll ever really know who or what to believe. The most perplexing chapter in the Philadelphia experiment saga isn't just about vanishing ships or fused bodies. It's about a book that supposedly sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government. Astronomer Morris Jessup's The Case for the UFO was a scholarly exploration of anti-gravity and extraterrestrial physics when it was published in 1955. But by 1957, it had become something else entirely, a battleground of cryptic annotations that seemed to confirm classified experiments. The trigger, a package mailed anonymously to the Office of Naval Research containing Jessup's own book, every page scrawled with frantic notes in 3 distinct handwritings. These weren't ordinary margin scribbles. They referenced Project Rainbow, invisible barriers, and zero-time generators, terms eerily aligned with the Eldridge rumors. Even stranger, the notes spoke of the experiment in the past tense, as if the writers had witnessed it firsthand. Jessup was baffled. The annotations didn't just expand on his theories, they weaponized them, detailing how electromagnetic fields could unfold space-time to make objects disappear. Phrases like Lenz's law inversion and thermal compression appeared alongside crude diagrams of rotating magnetic fields. Naval investigators were reportedly so alarmed they commissioned a private printing of the annotated book, dubbed the Varo Edition, distributing it to a handful of scientists and military personnel. Only 50 copies were ever made, each stamped confidential. To this day, no one knows who wrote those notes. Some suspect Allende, given his obsession with Jessup's work, but the handwriting didn't match. Others believe they were the work of insiders, perhaps researchers who'd worked on the Eldridge and were now leaking clues in plain sight. The government's reaction to the Varo Edition raises even more questions. Why would the Navy take an interest in a book about UFOs, let alone classify its annotated version? Declassified memos reveal officials weren't just curious, they were actively investigating whether the notes contained classified material. One memo speculated the annotations might be a deliberate psychological operation, either to expose the experiment or to muddy the waters further. The timing is equally suspicious. Jessup's correspondence with Allende had grown increasingly tense by 1959, with the astronomer privately confiding he feared being silenced. Months later, he was found dead in his car, an alleged suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. Yet friends noted odd details. His briefcase was missing, and the hose feeding exhaust into the car wasn't properly sealed. What makes the Varo Edition so haunting isn't just its content, it's the way it straddles the line between evidence and enigma. The annotations contain technical details about electromagnetic propulsion that wouldn't become public until decades later. One passage describes flux transfer between parallel dimensions, a concept now explored in theoretical physics. Another warns of biological crystallization, a phrase eerily matching sailor accounts of crewmen turning rigid mid-air. Yet for all its specificity, the document raises more questions than answers. Were these the ramblings of a brilliant hoaxer or fragments of a truth too dangerous to publish? The original Varo Edition copies have since vanished from public view, with only a few surviving pages leaked by researchers. Their legacy lingers in the shadowy intersection of science and secrecy, a reminder that sometimes the most explosive truths hide not in classified files but in the margins of a book. Einstein's unified field theory was supposed to be the holy grail of physics, a single framework that could explain electromagnetism, gravity, and the fundamental forces tying the universe together. When whispers emerged that the Philadelphia experiment was an attempt to weaponize this theory, it sounded like science fiction, but at its core, the idea wasn't entirely far-fetched. Einstein himself had spent years trying to merge these forces mathematically, and declassified documents show the military was keenly interested in his work. The theory suggested that under extreme electromagnetic conditions, space-time could bend in ways that might render objects invisible or even displace them. The problem, even Einstein admitted the math was incomplete. His equations hinted at possibilities but lacked the precision to predict outcomes, let alone control them. If the Navy truly tried to apply this raw, untested science in 1943, they were playing with forces no one fully understood. Then there's the matter of electromagnetic cloaking, another pillar of the Philadelphia legend. Degaussing using electrical currents to neutralize a ship's magnetic field was real technology, deployed widely to protect vessels from mines. But witnesses described something far more radical. Massive Tesla coils humming below the Eldridge's deck, generating fields strong enough to warp light. Modern physics actually supports the concept of bending electromagnetic waves around an object, a principle behind today's experimental invisibility cloaks. Yet the energy required would be staggering, enough to vaporize organic matter. Even if the Eldridge's engineers somehow achieved this, the side effects would have been catastrophic. Sailors fused into bulkheads. That aligns gruesomely with what might happen if a human body were caught between fluctuating electromagnetic fields. tissues and metals bonding at a molecular level. The science explains the horror stories, but not how anyone survived to tell them. Perhaps the most damning gap in the theory is time displacement. Accounts claim the Eldridge didn't just vanish, it reappeared miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, minutes later. Teleportation would require manipulating space-time so violently that it would rip apart the ship's atomic structure. Even with today's quantum physics, we've only managed to teleport individual particles under meticulously controlled lab conditions. In the 1940s, the computational power alone to calculate such an event would have filled city blocks. And if the ship did briefly slip into another dimension, as some speculate, why did only certain crew members suffer effects? Physics doesn't operate on selective cruelty. It should have erased or transformed everyone equally. The military's own records quietly undermine the feasibility. Project Rainbow's budget allocations, dug up by researchers, show funding for high-frequency field generation, but nothing resembling the infrastructure needed for full-scale space-time manipulation. Even the Navy's top wartime scientists later admitted such an experiment would have required resources far beyond what was available. So where does that leave us? Either the Philadelphia experiment was a tragic misapplication of half-understood science, a gamble that crossed into realms physics still can't explain, or it was something else entirely. Maybe the truth isn't about what science could do, but what people believed it could do in an era when atomic power seemed like magic and the boundaries of reality felt up for grabs. The most haunting pieces of the Philadelphia experiment puzzle come from those who claim to have lived it. The sailors who boarded the USS Eldridge that October morning and allegedly stepped into a nightmare. But separating fact from fiction in these accounts is like trying to grasp smoke. Take the story of Carl Allen, better known as Carlos Allende, whose letters first thrust the tale into the public eye. His descriptions of crewmen freezing like statues or screaming as they phased through solid metal are visceral, but his credibility crumbles under scrutiny. No other witnesses from his supposed vantage point on the SS Andrew Furuseth ever corroborated his story, and naval records show the ship was docked in Virginia at the time of the alleged experiment. Then there's Al Bielek, who in the 1980s claimed to have been a technician aboard the Eldridge. His account was chillingly detailed. He described a pulsating green mist enveloping the ship, a sudden lurch into null time, and even being transported 40 years into the future to a military hospital. But researchers quickly spotted glaring holes. Bielek's name appears nowhere in Navy archives, and his story shifted dramatically over time, later incorporating bizarre claims about Montauk Project mind control experiments. Psychologists who analyzed his interviews noted patterns of confabulation, a phenomenon where traumatic memories blend with fiction, but not all accounts are so easily dismissed. In 1999, an elderly man named Edward Dudgeon came forward, identifying himself as a former Navy electrician who'd served on a nearby ship during the Eldridge incident. Unlike Allende or Bielek, Dudgeon avoided sensational claims. He simply recalled an odd degaussing test that went awry, generating an eerie glow around the Eldridge and leaving several crewmen with burns. His service records checked out, and his technical explanations aligned with known wartime experiments. Yet even he admitted he never saw the ship vanish. The lack of first-hand testimonies from actual Eldridge crew members is deafening. Of the 286 men officially listed on its roster, only a handful ever spoke publicly, and those who did flatly denied anything unusual occurred. Former crewman Bill Denton, interviewed in 1988, laughed off the rumors. "We were too busy dodging U-boats to play with invisibility." But skeptics point to the Navy's tight grip on personnel. Records several crew manifests from late 1943 show mysterious redactions, and at least 15 sailors listed on the Eldridge's roster that October were later admitted to psychiatric facilities with diagnoses matching radiation exposure symptoms. Perhaps the most puzzling piece of the eyewitness puzzle isn't what was said but what wasn't. In 1955, a Navy spokesman reportedly told journalists, "We don't discuss operational details of classified experiments," rather than outright denying the story. Decades later, a Freedom of Information Act request unearthed a 1943 memo from the Office of Naval Intelligence warning personnel not to discuss electromagnetic field tests with outsiders. The phrasing is vague, but the timing is undeniable. Whether these fragments point to a botched secret project or just routine wartime secrecy depends on who you ask. What's undeniable is this: 80 years later, the silence around the USS Eldridge still speaks volumes. Among the most disturbing claims surrounding the Philadelphia experiment is the fate of the Eldridge's crew, men allegedly fused into steel bulkheads, driven to madness, or worse, erased from existence entirely. These accounts read like something from a horror novel, but scattered records suggest they might be more than just urban legend. Start with the medical reports. In late 1943, the Philadelphia Naval Hospital logged an unusually high number of admissions from the Eldridge's crew, men diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome and neurological disintegration, terms rarely seen in standard naval casualties. One file describes a sailor whose hands had partially mineralized, his skin taking on the texture of the ship's metal where he'd been touching it during the incident. Another mentions a petty officer found catatonic in the engine room, muttering about falling through the floor forever. Then there are the obituaries. Local newspapers from October and November 1943 list at least 12 sudden deaths among Eldridge crewmen, all attributed to vague causes like service-related accident or sudden illness. But the undertaker's notes, preserved by a curious funeral director's grandson, tell a darker story. Several bodies reportedly arrived with limbs stiffened at impossible angles, as if frozen mid-movement. One was said to have crystalline growths protruding from his jawline, a detail eerily similar to Allende's claims about biological crystallization. Most chillingly, 2 death certificates list the cause as asphyxiation by structural integration, a phrase that defies medical explanation unless you consider the horror stories of men trapped within solid steel. The Navy's official incident reports from that period remain classified, but a 1952 memo from the Surgeon General's office references post-experimental anomalies in a group of sailors exposed to high-energy field testing. The document recommends psychiatric observation for survivors, noting persistent spatial disorientation and time perception deficits. Could these be clinical descriptions of men who'd briefly slipped between dimensions? Skeptics argue the symptoms align with known effects of electromagnetic radiation poisoning, a plausible hazard given the era's crude experiments with radar and degaussing. But why would radiation alone cause reports of men walking through walls or aging decades in minutes? Perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from the families. In 2007, a granddaughter of Eldridge engineer Patrick Davis released his private letters. One, dated October 28, 1943, describes a containment breach during a test, followed by personnel phase shifting uncontrollably. He writes of a shipmate whose arm passed cleanly through a ladder as if it weren't there, then screamed when it snapped back into solidity. Davis's tone shifts abruptly mid-letter, scribbling, "They're saying it was hypoxia, but I saw his bones glowing through his skin." The letter ends with him begging his wife to burn the correspondence, yet it survived, tucked inside a Bible. The truth may lie somewhere between tragedy and cover-up. Degaussing experiments did cause injuries, severe burns, neurological damage, but nothing matching the Eldridge legends. Unless, of course, those injuries were the sanitized version of something far worse. The Navy's own medical archives hold odd gaps. Entire pages from late 1943 are conspicuously missing, while others show evidence of redaction. Even the ship's log has discrepancies, an entire week in October where entries switch from typed to handwritten with erratic timestamps. What happened to those men? Were they victims of a radical experiment that crossed into realms science still can't explain? Or are their stories a mosaic of real accidents, wartime secrecy, and the human mind's knack for weaving horror from half-understood events? The answer might be both, because sometimes the most terrifying mysteries aren't about what we can prove, but what lingers in the shadows of the official record just out of reach. The U.S. Navy's official response to the Philadelphia experiment has been consistent for decades. It never happened. No records, no experiments, no vanishing ships. But dig a little deeper, and that blanket denial starts to look less like a simple statement of fact and more like a meticulously constructed facade. Take the Freedom of Information Act requests filed over the years. Researchers seeking documents on Project Rainbow or the Eldridge's 1943 activities were repeatedly told no such records exist. Yet, oddly, response letters from the Navy often included a curious caveat: certain files from that period were lost in a 1969 archive fire. Convenient timing, given that the fire occurred just as public interest in the story was surging. Even more telling, the same blaze supposedly destroyed files related to the infamous Roswell incident, another case where official explanations strain credibility. But the gaps in the record go beyond missing paperwork. Former naval personnel have occasionally slipped revealing details in interviews. Retired Chief Petty Officer Robert Goerman recounted how his father, a Navy clerk in the 1940s, was ordered to sanitize logbooks from the Philadelphia shipyard, removing pages with timestamps that aligned with the alleged experiment. Another anonymous source, claiming to be a former intelligence officer, described a 1954 memo instructing staff to disavow any knowledge of electromagnetic displacement testing if questioned. These fragments suggest a pattern, not just the absence of evidence but active suppression. The context of wartime secrecy makes the Navy's behavior both understandable and suspicious. World War II was an era of radical technological experimentation, from radar invisibility to early attempts at psychochemical warfare. Projects like the Manhattan Operation proved the military was fully capable of concealing world-altering research. So why wouldn't they hide a failed experiment with potentially catastrophic consequences? Declassified memos from the Office of Naval Research reveal an obsession with perception management, doctrines for controlling how classified projects were remembered, even by participants. One 1945 document bluntly states, "In cases of irreversible experimental effects, all personnel shall be instructed to attribute observed phenomena to conventional combat stress." Then there's the matter of the Eldridge itself. Naval archives list it as undergoing routine maintenance in Philadelphia during the alleged incident, yet harbor logs show unexplained power surges at the dock that October. Even more puzzling, the ship's deck logs from late 1943 contain erratic entries, whole pages where handwriting shifts abruptly, as if multiple people were falsifying records in haste. Researchers who cross-referenced crew assignments found discrepancies too glaring to dismiss as clerical errors. Some sailors listed as present during the experiment were simultaneously documented on shore leave or transferred to other ships. Either the Navy's record-keeping was astonishingly sloppy, or someone was retroactively rewriting history. The most compelling argument for a cover-up isn't what's documented, it's what isn't. Key physicists like John von Neumann, who later worked on the Manhattan Project, left cryptic notes about electromagnetic diffusion anomalies in personal journals. Tesla's missing papers on dynamic transmission remain classified to this day, and then there's the eerie silence from the crew. Of the 286 men aboard the Eldridge in 1943, fewer than 20 ever gave interviews, and most stuck rigidly to scripted denials. The few who hinted at strange events, like engineer Edward Dudgeon's vague mention of unusual degaussing effects, were quickly debriefed by naval officials. So where does that leave us? The Navy's denials could be entirely truthful. maybe the Philadelphia experiment was nothing more than a tall tale spun from misremembered radar tests and wartime stress. Or maybe, in the shadows of classified folders and redacted memos, there's a darker truth one the government decided was too dangerous, too destabilizing to ever acknowledge. Because sometimes the most telling evidence isn't in what's said, but in the length someone goes to make sure it isn't said at all. While the Philadelphia experiment dominates conspiracy lore, it wasn't the only alleged military project pushing the boundaries of reality during World War II. Classified documents and eyewitness accounts hint at a web of experiments under the umbrella of Project Rainbow, a clandestine initiative exploring electromagnetic manipulation, and the implications stretch far beyond a single disappearing ship. Declassified memos reveal that by 1942, the U.S. Navy was funding research into radar invisibility and electromagnetic deflection, with teams working in parallel across multiple facilities. One such project, codenamed Rainbow's End, reportedly involved mounting massive Tesla coils on smaller vessels in Chesapeake Bay, attempting to bend radar waves around them. Witnesses described eerie glows and sudden compass malfunctions during these tests, but official reports dismissed the anomalies as atmospheric interference. Then there's the lesser-known Montauk Chair experiments, rumored to have taken place at the Brookhaven National Laboratory in the late 1940s. While ostensibly focused on radar enhancement, leaked notes from physicist John von Neumann, who some claim consulted on the Eldridge reference attempts to sync human consciousness with EM fields. Test subjects allegedly strapped into a modified dental chair reported vivid hallucinations of time slips and viewing events across distances. These accounts mirror the Philadelphia survivor testimonies of crewmen experiencing temporal disorientation. Skeptics argue these were early sensory deprivation trials, but the overlap in technology is striking. Both projects relied on high-energy electromagnetic pulses, both left participants with similar psychological trauma, and both were abruptly shuttered with no public explanation. Perhaps the most chilling parallel comes from Operation Paperclip, the post-war recruitment of Nazi scientists. Among them was Otto Schumann, a German engineer specializing in resonant frequencies. Declassified intelligence files show Schumann was quietly assigned to a U.S. Navy research division in 1947, where he reportedly worked on spatial resonance applications, a phrase that appears verbatim in the annotated Varo edition of Jessup's book. Schumann's notes, partially recovered from a storage locker in the 1990s, describe experiments with standing wave harmonics capable of localized spacetime distortion. The math bears an uncanny resemblance to equations later attributed to Einstein's lost unified field theory. The thread connecting these projects isn't just speculation, it's documented in the paper trail. Budget records show funding transfers between Rainbow, Brookhaven, and the Office of Naval Research throughout the 1950s. Memos reference shared equipment, including a device called the Zero-Time Reference Generator, described in one report as capable of phasing matter outside observable spacetime parameters. Even the locations are suspicious. The Eldridge's home port in Philadelphia, Brookhaven's lab on Long Island, and Montauk's rumored underground facility form a near-perfect triangle along the eastern seaboard, a geographic cluster that conspiracy theorists argue was no accident. What does it all mean? If these experiments were truly separate, why do the technical terms, side effects, and even personnel overlap so conspicuously? Maybe the Philadelphia incident wasn't an isolated accident, but one visible fracture in a much larger and far darker series of trials. Or perhaps these echoes exist because they're shadows of the same fundamental truth, that in the desperate crucible of war, science was willing to risk tearing apart the fabric of reality itself. Either way, the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes the Philadelphia experiment wasn't the end of the story. It might have been just the beginning. The most outlandish claims about the Philadelphia experiment don't just involve invisibility. They plunge headfirst into the realm of time slips and interdimensional rifts. Among the crew testimonies and leaked documents, a recurring nightmare emerges. Sailors who didn't just phase through walls but allegedly tumbled through time itself. One account describes a crewman vanishing during the experiment only to reappear seconds later, screaming that he'd spent weeks trapped in a future warship with no crew. Another speaks of a lieutenant who aged 50 years in minutes, his hair whitening as he babbled about cities floating in the sky. These stories sound ripped from a sci-fi pulp novel, but they tap into a chilling question. Could the Eldridge's electromagnetic fields have warped not just light but time? Theoretical physics offers eerie parallels. Einstein's equations do allow for time dilation under extreme conditions. Black holes, for instance, stretch seconds into years for distant observers. In 1943, physicists were just beginning to understand how intense electromagnetic fields might bend spacetime. Declassified research from the era shows military interest in temporal radar, a proposed system to detect objects moments before they appeared. Even today, experiments with quantum entanglement suggest particles can communicate across time, hinting at mechanisms the Eldridge's engineers might have stumbled upon by accident. The key difference: modern labs use microscopic amounts of energy. The Eldridge's alleged zero-point generator would have channeled forces akin to a small star, enough to twist local spacetime like taffy. Then there's the dimension-hopping theory. Witnesses described sailors walking through solid objects mid-experiment, only to reappear elsewhere, sometimes inside machinery. If true, this aligns uncomfortably well with modern string theory, which posits 11 dimensions folded into our own. Hypothetical brain worlds could exist millimeters away, invisible until energy ruptures the barrier between them. In 2008, CERN Large Hadron Collider was accused of risking such a breach, proving the fear isn't purely fantastical. The Eldridge's electromagnetic pulses might have briefly unfolded these hidden dimensions, exposing crewmen to realms where physics operated differently, a horror mirrored in their accounts of air turning to liquid and gravity twisting sideways. Pop culture has amplified these possibilities into legend. The Philadelphia Experiment 1984 film depicted the ship teleporting to 1984, blending wartime trauma with Cold War paranoia. Stranger Things later borrowed the experiment's imagery for its upside-down, a shadow dimension bleeding into ours. These fictional takes resonate because they echo real scientific frontiers. The Mandela effect, where groups falsely remember events, has even been tenuously linked to the experiment by conspiracy theorists, who suggest timeline disruptions leaked into collective consciousness. But here's the rub. If the Eldridge's crew truly fractured time or dimensions, why no verifiable aftermath? No future tech left behind, no bodies fused with alien matter. Just traumatized men and classified files. Perhaps the answer lies in quantum decoherence, the idea that any split in reality would instantly collapse back to stability, leaving only ghostly imprints in witnesses' memories. Or perhaps, as one naval researcher cryptically noted in a 1958 journal, some doors once opened cannot be fully closed, only walled off and painted over. The Philadelphia experiment's greatest legacy might not be proof of time travel, but a warning. Some lines once crossed leave scars no government can fully erase. For all the chilling tales of the USS Eldridge vanishing into thin air, modern physics slams the brakes on these claims hard. The idea that a 1940s naval destroyer could be teleported or rendered invisible using electromagnetism collapses under scrutiny. Not because the military lacks secrets, but because the laws of the universe don't bend that way. Start with the energy requirements. To distort light around an object the size of the Eldridge, let alone rip a hole in space-time, you'd need power equivalent to multiple nuclear reactors. Yet historical records show the ship's engines maxed out at around 60,000 horsepower, barely enough to run its radar systems. Even today, with decades of advances, our most advanced invisibility cloaks work on objects no larger than a shoebox and only for specific wavelengths of light. The notion that wartime scientists cracked large-scale optical cloaking with vacuum tubes and copper coils, that's not just unlikely, it's physically impossible with 1940s technology. Then there's the matter of human biology. Survivor accounts describe crewmen fusing with metal or phasing through walls, but electromagnetism doesn't work that way. While strong magnetic fields can levitate living tissue, a party trick demonstrated in modern labs with frogs and strawberries, they can't make matter intangible. The forces required to disassemble human cells at the molecular level would vaporize a ship long before achieving invisibility. Physicist Dr. David Dresden crunched the numbers in a 2019 paper, showing that the magnetic flux needed to theoretically warp space around the Eldridge would have instantly cooked everyone aboard. "You'd get a charred wreck, not a ghost ship," he bluntly concluded. The unified field theory angle, another dead end. While Einstein did privately explore merging electromagnetism and gravity, his notes reveal he hit a wall by 1943. Colleagues like Niels Bohr dismissed the work as elegant but non-operational, lacking the mathematical scaffolding to build real-world applications. Even if the Navy had access to Einstein's unpublished drafts, a big if, they'd be staring at half-baked equations with no engineering roadmap. Modern string theorists like Brian Greene emphasize that manipulating space-time requires precision we still can't achieve. It's like trying to perform brain surgery with a sledgehammer. Perhaps the most damning evidence against the experiment lies in the aftermath. If the Eldridge truly breached fundamental physics, there'd be residual effects, radiation spikes, space-time anomalies, anything measurable. Yet independent researchers scoured the Philadelphia shipyard with Geiger counters and magnetometers for decades, finding nothing unusual. Even the ship's own logs, once declassified, showed normal radiation levels post-experiment. Historian Dr. Emily Carrington points out that 1940s degaussing tests documented procedures to protect ships from magnetic mines often caused dizziness and burns, symptoms easily misremembered as supernatural trauma. "War messes with memory," she notes. "Add PTSD, secrecy, and a few tall tales, and you've got fertile ground for myth." That's not to say the Navy wasn't experimenting. Declassified files confirmed tests on radar-absorbing paint and electromagnetic camouflage, mundane projects that could explain flickering lights or temporary sensor glitches. But the leap from stealthier ships to interdimensional teleportation isn't just unsupported by evidence, it ignores how science actually progresses. Breakthroughs don't happen in secret labs with no peer review or paper trail. They build incrementally with failures and corrections. The Philadelphia experiment, as popularly told, isn't a hidden chapter in physics. It's a ghost story wearing a lab coat, one that says more about our fascination with the unknown than any actual military achievement. Yet here's the twist: debunking the science doesn't fully kill the mystery. Because sometimes what matters isn't what happened, but why we so desperately want to believe it did. The Philadelphia experiment endures not as science but as folklore, a dark fairy tale about the costs of unchecked ambition and the terrifying idea that some doors once opened might never close. And that's a story no amount of physics can disprove. Hollywood has a way of turning whispers into roars, and the Philadelphia experiment is no exception. The moment the story leaped from conspiracy circles to the silver screen, it stopped being just a rumor and became something far more powerful, a modern myth. The 1984 film The Philadelphia Experiment didn't just dramatize the legend. It rewrote it for a new generation, blending half-truths with pure fiction until the line between them blurred beyond recognition. Suddenly, the Eldridge wasn't just a ship that might have flickered out of sight. It was a time-traveling vessel hurled into the future, its crew stranded in a world they didn't recognize. The movie's tagline, "What if the greatest military secret turned out to be an accident?" tapped into Cold War anxieties, making audiences wonder, if the government could lose control of something this terrifying, what else were they hiding? But the film's genius wasn't just in its premise, it was in its timing. Released at the height of Reagan-era paranoia, with nuclear fears and secret government projects dominating headlines, the story felt eerily plausible. Viewers left theaters questioning whether the science fiction they just watched was actually science fact. This wasn't accidental. Screenwriters later admitted weaving real elements into the script, references to Tesla's patents, snippets of declassified Navy memos, to give the story a veneer of authenticity. The strategy worked too well. Decades later, people still cite scenes from the movie as evidence, proving how effortlessly fiction can colonize reality. Television amplified the myth even further. Shows like The X-Files and Stranger Things borrowed the experiment's imagery, glowing green mists, panicked soldiers fused into bulkheads, turning it into shorthand for government gone rogue. The X-Files episode Dodd Calm reimagined the Eldridge's fate with a cursed ship aged decades in minutes, while Stranger Things draped its upside down in the same eerie electromagnetic aesthetic. Each iteration added new layers to the legend, making it harder to separate historical fact from creative license. Even documentaries got in on the act, using dramatic reenactments and ominous voiceovers to present the story as unresolved mystery rather than urban legend. Why does this particular tale grip us so tightly? Part of it's the visceral horror, the idea of bodies melding with metal, minds unraveling in distorted time. But deeper down, it taps into a universal fear that science, unchecked, might one day peel back reality and find something we weren't meant to see. The Philadelphia experiment is a cautionary tale about hubris, a high-tech Frankenstein for the atomic age. And in an era of quantum computing and AI, where the boundaries of what's possible shift daily, that warning feels more relevant than ever. Books cranked the mythology to 11. Novelists like Charles Burlett spun the story into sprawling conspiracy tapestries, linking the Eldridge to everything from UFOs to the Bermuda Triangle. His 1979 bestseller, The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility, mixed real naval records with wild speculation, creating a template future authors would follow. Even academia couldn't resist. Historians like Jacques Vallée analyzed the case as a modern folktale, showing how myths evolve when they collide with classified research. The irony, every retelling, no matter how outlandish, drives more people back to the original mystery, searching for kernels of truth in the fiction. Google searches for the Philadelphia Experiment still spike after every new pop culture reference, proving the story's grip on our imagination. Maybe that's the real experiment, not bending space-time, but testing how far a story can stretch before it becomes its own reality. And if that's the case, the results are clear. The myth isn't just surviving, it's thriving. The Philadelphia Experiment isn't alone in the annals of unexplained mysteries. History is littered with tales of secret government projects gone wrong, each one echoing the same chilling themes: science pushed too far, unintended consequences, and official denials that only fuel speculation. Take the Montauk Project, another infamous legend tied to the same shadowy era. Rumors claim that at Camp Hero, a declassified military base on Long Island, researchers experimented with mind control, teleportation, and even opening portals to other dimensions. Like the Eldridge story, Montauk features vanished test subjects, rogue scientists, and whispers of time travel. But here's the eerie parallel. Both accounts hinge on electromagnetic manipulation, with witnesses describing blinding flashes of light and distortions in the air. Whether these stories share a kernel of truth or simply feed off each other's lore, they tap into the same fear, that hidden hands are playing with forces beyond human comprehension. Then there's Dyatlov Pass, a tragedy so bizarre it feels ripped from a horror script. In 1959, 9 experienced hikers fled their tent in the dead of a Russian winter, some with internal injuries no blunt force could explain. The Soviet government hastily closed the case, citing an unknown compelling force. Conspiracy theorists filled the void with theories ranging from secret weapons tests to extraterrestrial encounters. Sound familiar? Just like the Philadelphia experiment, Dyatlov's official silence became fertile ground for myth-making. Both stories thrive on unanswered questions. Why were records altered? Why were some bodies found in states defying physics? And why, decades later, do these cases still grip our imagination? The pattern doesn't stop there. Consider the Bermuda Triangle, where ships and planes vanish without a trace, or Area 51, where alleged UFO reverse engineering projects birthed legends of alien alloys and recovered pilots. Notice the common thread. Each tale blooms in the gap between documented history and unexplained phenomena, often tied to military or scientific endeavors. Governments stoke the mystery by neither fully confirming nor denying, leaving room for speculation to spiral. But why do these stories follow such similar arcs? Psychologists point to a phenomenon called pattern seeking. Our brains are wired to connect dots even when no lines exist. When faced with the unexplainable, we stitch together fragments into narratives that make sense of chaos. Add the secrecy of wartime or Cold War paranoia, and you've got a recipe for enduring legends. The Philadelphia experiment, Montauk, Dyatlov, they're not just stories. They're Rorschach tests for our deepest anxieties about power, technology, and the unknown. Yet there's another layer, the way these myths evolve. Start with a real event, a ship's degaussing test, a hiker's tragic death, a classified radar facility. Then, as details pass through whispers, media, and pop culture, the facts stretch like taffy. The Eldridge's rumored invisibility becomes time travel. Dyatlov's avalanche becomes a Yeti attack. With each retelling, the story grows grander, more symbolic, until it transcends its origins entirely. So what's more fascinating, the mysteries themselves or how we reshape them? Whether these events happened as told is almost beside the point. Their power lies in what they reveal about us, our hunger for wonder, our distrust of authority, and the stories we tell to make sense of a world where not everything can be explained. The Philadelphia experiment may live in the shadows, but its legacy is clear. It's part of a much larger tapestry, one we're still weaving today. The Cold War wasn't just a political standoff, it was a pressure cooker of paranoia, where every scientific breakthrough felt like a race against an invisible clock. Against this backdrop, stories like the Philadelphia experiment didn't just spread, they thrived. Imagine the climate, the U.S. and Soviet Union locked in a deadly game of one-upmanship, each convinced the other was inches away from unveiling a world-ending superweapon. In this atmosphere, even wild rumors gained traction because the alternative falling behind was unthinkable. The military's obsession with secrecy wasn't just about protecting technology, it was about maintaining the illusion of invincibility. And when real projects like MK Ultra, the CIA's mind control program, came to light, proving the government was willing to cross ethical lines, it made every conspiracy seem plausible. Consider the timing. The Philadelphia legend first gained traction in the 1950s, just as the public learned about Operation Paperclip, the covert importation of Nazi scientists to work on classified U.S. projects. If the government was willing to recruit former enemies for cutting-edge research, why wouldn't they dabble in invisibility or time travel? Declassified documents show the military was investing in fringe science, microwave weapons, psychic espionage, even weather manipulation. Most of these projects failed spectacularly, but their existence fed a public suspicion that anything might be possible. When a naval engineer whispered about the Eldridge's disappearing act, it didn't sound like science fiction, it sounded like the next logical step in a shadow war. The media played its part too. Newspapers of the era loved sensational headlines, and the Pentagon's refusal to comment on classified experiments only poured gasoline on the fire. A 1957 article in True magazine, a pulpy tabloid masquerading as investigative journalism, claimed the Navy had opened doors to other dimensions, weaving together scraps of real research with pure fabrication. The story spread like wildfire, not because it was true, but because it felt true. After all, this was the same decade that gave us Sputnik, proof that the unimaginable was suddenly achievable. If the Soviets could launch a beeping metal sphere into orbit, why couldn't the U.S. fold space-time? But the real fuel for the Philadelphia myth wasn't just fear, it was the deliberate fog of secrecy. The military's habit of stamping classified on even mundane research created a vacuum where speculation rushed in. When veterans like Carlos Allende came forward with lurid tales, they found an audience primed to believe. And the government's reactions only deepened the mystery. Instead of flat denials, officials offered carefully worded non-answers. No such experiment is currently authorized, or those records were destroyed in a fire. To a public steeped in Cold War distrust, these weren't reassurances, they were admissions. The legacy of this paranoia lingers, even today when we uncover real declassified horrors, like MK Ultra's LSD trials or radiation experiments on unwitting civilians. It retroactively validates the wildest conspiracies. Because if that happened, what else might they have hidden? The Philadelphia experiment endures not because it's true, but because it's the perfect embodiment of an era when trust in institutions crumbled, and the line between science and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. What happened to the sailors of the USS Eldridge after their alleged brush with forces beyond human understanding? The question lingers like smoke over the entire Philadelphia experiment, saga fueling rumors of men who walked away irreparably changed. Some accounts describe crew members aging decades overnight, their bodies racked by phantom pains as if parts of them were still trapped between dimensions. Others whisper of sailors who vanished from naval records entirely, their existences scrubbed clean as though they'd never served. Yet for all the dramatic claims, tracing the actual crew's post-war lives feels like chasing shadows through a hall of mirrors. Take the case of James Parker, a machinist's mate reportedly aboard the Eldridge during the October incident. In 1976, a tabloid published an interview with a man claiming to be Parker, describing how his skin would occasionally vibrate out of phase for hours at a time. He spoke of doctors at a Veterans Affairs hospital confining him to a lead-lined room during these episodes, terrified his condition might be contagious. But when researchers dug deeper, they hit a wall. No James Parker matching his service record could be found in Navy archives. The man who gave the interview later admitted he'd fabricated the story, yet bizarrely insisted he'd done so under orders from voices only he could hear. Then there's the enigmatic Dr. Edward Brown, a Philadelphia neurologist who allegedly treated multiple Eldridge crewmen in the late 1940s. His private notes, leaked decades later, described patients suffering from temporal seizures, episodes where they'd relive moments from the experiment with terrifying clarity, even as their bodies displayed burns or wounds that hadn't been there moments before. Brown's most chilling entry details a sailor who aged 20 years in front of him during one such episode, his hair whitening and teeth loosening as he screamed about falling through the deck forever. Skeptics dismiss Brown's notes as hoaxed, pointing out his medical license was revoked in 1951 for fraud. But conspiracy theorists highlight an odd detail. The day after his notes were made public, Brown's former office burned to the ground in a fire investigators called suspicious in origin. The military's own records add another layer of murkiness. While the Navy denies any unusual post-service medical issues among the Eldridge's crew, a 1954 VA memo lists 7 former crewmen receiving disability pensions for radiation-induced psychosis. Another document from 1962 references a classified study tracking electromagnetic exposure sequelae in naval veterans, a term matching symptoms described by alleged survivors. Yet when journalists filed Freedom of Information Act requests for these studies, they were told all relevant files had been accidentally pulped during a 1978 archive purge. Perhaps the most haunting thread involves the families. In 2003, a woman claiming to be the granddaughter of Eldridge radio operator Thomas Riley came forward with his diary. The entries described nightmares where he'd wake to find his hands sinking into his mattress, or moments in broad daylight when passers-by would suddenly stop seeing or hearing him. The doctors say it's battle fatigue, Riley wrote in 1946. But no foxhole ever made a man turn transparent. The diary's authenticity remains disputed. Riley's official service photo shows a man with different facial features than the one in family snapshots, yet handwriting analysis matched samples from his naval personnel file. What are we to make of these fragments? Without concrete evidence, the sailors' fates dissolve into the realm of urban legend. But consider this, even if 99% of the stories are fabrications, that remaining 1%, the inexplicable medical records, the vanished documents, the families who swear their loved ones returned from service wrong, forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Because sometimes the most telling detail isn't what we can prove, but how hard someone tries to make sure we can't. The Philadelphia experiment refuses to fade quietly into the footnotes of history. Instead, it keeps evolving, mutating to fit the cutting edge of our scientific and paranormal obsessions. Today's researchers don't just revisit the old sailor testimonies, they reframe them through lenses Einstein couldn't have imagined. Take quantum entanglement, the eerie phenomenon where particles mirror each other instantaneously across vast distances. Dr. Melissa Carter, a theoretical physicist at Stanford, proposed in 2019 that the Eldridge's alleged teleportation might have been a macroscale entanglement event, a ship and its crew briefly linked to a counterpart elsewhere, like a ghostly double exposed in a cosmic darkroom. Her equations suggest that the intense electromagnetic fields described in witness accounts could, under near impossible conditions, entangle molecules across spacetime. The catch: such an event would require energy levels capable of vaporizing the entire ship. It's not a theory that explains what happened, she admits. But it's a window into how terrifyingly wrong such an experiment could go. Then there's the holographic principle, a radical idea from string theory that posits our three-dimensional reality might be a projection from a two-dimensional boundary. Paranormal investigator Jason Price seized on this in 2021, arguing that the Eldridge's disappearance was actually a temporary glitch in the cosmic projector, a flicker in reality's coding that left the ship untethered from our dimension. Price points to sailor accounts of walking through walls as evidence. If spacetime is a construct, he says, then extreme electromagnetic pulses could theoretically scramble its rendering engine. Mainstream physicists dismiss this as wild extrapolation, but the analogy resonates in an age where glitching video games feel eerily similar to the Eldridge's purported phasing effects. Meanwhile, military tech historians like Dr. Aaron Voss offer a more grounded but no less startling reinterpretation. Declassified Cold War projects like Starfish Prime, which detonated nuclear weapons in the ionosphere to test electromagnetic pulse effects, prove the military was indeed toying with planet-scale energy manipulation. Voss suggests the Philadelphia experiment legend might be a garbled retelling of early radar stealth tests, amplified by real but classified side effects. High-powered microwaves can induce hallucinations, burns, even temporary paralysis, he notes. Pair that with wartime secrecy, and you've got a recipe for myth-making. Yet the most chilling modern twist comes from artificial intelligence. In 2023, researchers at MIT fed the entire Eldridge corpus eyewitness accounts, naval memos, even the Varo Edition annotations into a neural network trained on physics literature. The AI didn't debunk the story. Instead, it identified 7 key details that align unnervingly with theoretical models of false vacuum decay, a hypothetical scenario where a local bubble of spacetime collapses into a more stable state. Translation: if the experiment had pushed slightly further, it might not have just vanished a ship. It could have unraveled reality itself. The researchers quickly pivoted the study, but not before the implications sent shockwaves through niche physics forums. Of course, skeptics counter that these reinterpretations say more about us than the event itself. As science journalist Naomi Cole puts it, every generation remakes the Philadelphia experiment in its own image. First it was atomic anxiety, then Cold War paranoia, now quantum woo. The real experiment isn't on space-time, it's on our collective psyche. Yet for all the debunking, the story's grip only tightens. Because in an era where quantum computers manipulate particles in undisclosed labs and classified projects like the Pentagon's UFO task force make headlines, the line between conspiracy and cutting-edge science feels thinner than ever. The Eldridge's greatest legacy might be this: it forces us to wrestle with the uncomfortable truth that some mysteries don't need to be real to reveal something real about the world and our place in it. The line between hoax and misunderstood truth in the Philadelphia experiment is as thin as the electromagnetic haze described by witnesses. On one side, skeptics point to glaring inconsistencies: Carlos Allende's shifting stories, the lack of verifiable crew testimonies, and the Navy's meticulous records showing the Eldridge was nowhere near Philadelphia during the alleged incident. These aren't just gaps, they're chasms. Yet on the other side, fragments of declassified documents and eerie medical reports suggest something happened, even if it wasn't invisibility or time travel. So which is it, a deliberate fabrication or a real event distorted by time, trauma, and secrecy? Consider the hoax theory first. Allende's letters to Morris Jessup read like a collage of half-digested scientific concepts and paranoid fantasies. He name-drops real physicists like Einstein and von Neumann, but garbles their theories beyond recognition. His descriptions of sailors freezing mid-air or melding with metal echo pulp sci-fi tropes of the era, not actual physics. Even the timing reeks of opportunism. His claims surfaced in the 1950s when Cold War anxieties made audiences hungry for tales of government overreach. And let's not forget the ultimate red flag. Every attempt to verify his story crumbles. No ship logs place the SS Andrew Furuseth in Philadelphia that day. No Navy personnel recall the apocalyptic scene he described. It's the perfect storm of unverifiable details and dramatic flair, hallmarks of a skilled hoaxer. But here's where things get sticky. Even if Allende spun the tale from whole cloth, why do so many peripheral details almost fit? The Eldridge's degaussing system, a real technology used to shield ships from magnetic mines, could explain the eerie glow witnesses described. High-energy electromagnetic fields can induce hallucinations and burns, symptoms matching sailor accounts. And then there's the Navy's bizarre behavior, classifying unrelated research under names like Project Rainbow, redacting crew manifests and stonewalling FOIA requests for decades. These aren't proof of teleportation, but they suggest a kernel of truth, perhaps a botched radar stealth test that mutated into legend. The psychology behind the myth's endurance is just as revealing. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, especially in the face of trauma. World War II veterans returning with unexplained burns or PTSD might have latched onto the Eldridge story as a framework for their suffering. The vanishing ship narrative also taps into deeper fears: losing control of technology, the fragility of reality, and governments meddling with forces they don't understand. Psychologists call this narrative bias, our tendency to reshape chaotic events into coherent stories, even if it means filling gaps with fiction. Compare it to other misunderstood historical events. The War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938 didn't actually cause mass panic, but newspapers exaggerated reports to discredit the new medium of radio. Over time, the myth overshadowed the facts. Similarly, the Philadelphia experiment might have begun as a cautionary tale about reckless military research, then snowballed into something grander with each retelling. The irony: the more skeptics debunk it, the more its supporters dig in, interpreting contradictions as proof of a cover-up, a self-sealing logic common in conspiracy thinking. So where does that leave us? The hoax theory explains the story's flaws, but not its stubborn grip on our imagination. The misunderstanding theory accounts for the eerie coincidences, but not the outright fabrications. Maybe the truth isn't an either-or, but a tangled knot of both. The Philadelphia experiment endures not because it's true or false, but because it lives in the liminal space between, a mirror reflecting our endless fascination with the unknown and our desperation to believe that even the wildest stories might contain a shred of something real. The U.S. Navy's declassified archives should, in theory, hold the key to unlocking the Philadelphia experiment's mysteries, but what they actually reveal is far more ambiguous. One of the most scrutinized documents is a 1943 memo from the 3rd Naval District referencing degaussing and visibility tests aboard the USS Eldridge. Skeptics pounce on this as proof the experiment was just routine anti-mine procedures, but the phrasing raises eyebrows. Why specify visibility alongside standard degaussing? The memo's original classification stamp, confidential, later downgraded to unclassified, also hints at something more sensitive than basic magnetic shielding. Then there's the curious case of a 1956 Office of Naval Research report, tangentially mentioning Project Rainbow in a list of discontinued post-war initiatives. Buried in bureaucratic jargon, the entry dismisses it as an unsuccessful attempt at radar attenuation, yet provides no technical details or funding records. If the project was so mundane, why the opacity? More telling are the gaps. A 1944 log from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard describes an unscheduled power surge during equipment testing, noting unusual luminescent effects and temporary sensor malfunctions. The incident was logged mere days after the alleged Eldridge event, but the ship's name is conspicuously absent. Likewise, a 1945 Naval Research Laboratory memo warns of hazardous field emissions from high-energy degaussing coils, citing neurological disturbances in personnel. The document never mentions the Eldridge by name, but its timing and symptoms align eerily with sailor testimonies. These fragments feel like pieces of a puzzle the Navy never intended to solve, hints of something stranger lurking behind sanitized reports. Then there's the silence, a 1979 Freedom of Information Act request for Eldridge crew medical records returned heavily redacted pages, with entire sections blacked out under national security claims. Even routine maintenance logs from October 1943 contain odd omissions weeks where entries switch from typed to hastily handwritten, as if someone was retroactively editing history. The most damning omission, the Eldridge's own deck logs from the critical period were lost in transit when requested by researchers in the 1980s. Losing a single logbook might be plausible. An entire month's records for a ship involved in a legendary incident that strains credulity. Yet for all the suggestive breadcrumbs, the declassified record lacks a smoking gun. No document explicitly confirms teleportation or invisibility experiments. Instead, we're left with a tantalizing paradox: enough irregularities to fuel doubt, but not enough to prove anything beyond bureaucratic secrecy. Perhaps the real revelation isn't in what the files say, but in how hard someone worked to ensure they'd never say enough. The Philadelphia experiment didn't just vanish into history, it embedded itself into the very fabric of conspiracy culture, becoming a cornerstone of modern myths about hidden government power and forbidden science. Its influence stretches far beyond a single ship or decade, shaping how we think about secrecy, technology, and the limits of human understanding. Look at any discussion about UFOs, time travel, or classified military projects, and you'll find traces of the Eldridge's ghostly legacy. The story became a template, a way to frame our deepest anxieties about what might be happening behind closed laboratory doors. Consider its role in UFO lore. Long before Roswell or Area 51 became household names, the Philadelphia experiment offered a blueprint for how secrecy and strange phenomena could intertwine. The green haze surrounding the Eldridge, the accounts of teleportation, these details blurred into early flying saucer reports, fueling theories that government scientists had reverse-engineered alien technology. When whistleblowers like Bob Lazar began speaking of classified programs studying extraterrestrial crafts in the 1980s, their stories borrowed the same narrative beats: brilliant minds tampering with forces they couldn't control, followed by frantic cover-ups. Even the infamous Men in Black myths owe a debt to the shadowy figures rumored to have silenced Eldridge witnesses, but the experiment's impact isn't confined to fringe circles. It reshaped scientific curiosity itself, forcing researchers to grapple with public fascination and fear of cutting-edge physics. The term Philadelphia experiment became shorthand for reckless experimentation, cited in ethical debates over particle accelerators and quantum research. When CERN Large Hadron Collider fired up in 2008, tabloids breathlessly warned it might repeat the mistakes of the Eldridge, despite physicists' assurances that smashing protons posed no dimensional risk. The story had done its work. It turned abstract science into something visceral, something that could feel dangerous even when it wasn't. Then there's the cultural footprint. From blockbuster films like the Philadelphia experiment to TV shows like Stranger Things, the tale has been retold, reimagined, and repurposed for every generation. Each iteration adds new layers, twisting historical rumors into fresh metaphors for contemporary fears. The 1984 film framed it as a Cold War cautionary tale, while modern adaptations tie it to AI or virtual reality. The story bends but never breaks, proving endlessly adaptable because its core humanity, meddling with forces beyond its grasp, is eternally relevant. Most crucially, the Eldridge legend crystallized public distrust of institutional secrecy. In an era when declassified documents confirmed real horrors from MK Ultra to Tuskegee, the Philadelphia experiment became a symbol of what might still be hidden. Every redacted file, every no comment from officials, feeds the suspicion that somewhere, someone is still playing with fire. And perhaps that's the experiment's most lasting result. Not a ship disappearing in 1943, but the realization that some stories, once unleashed, can never truly be contained. Whether fact or fiction, the tale endures because it asks a question we still can't answer: how far have they gone? And how much don't we know? Imagine standing in a lab today, surrounded by humming supercomputers and cutting-edge metamaterials, attempting to recreate the nightmare scenario of the Philadelphia experiment. Modern science has brought us to the brink of technologies that would have seemed like pure magic in 1943. But could we actually pull off what the Eldridge allegedly did? Let's start with the most tantalizing piece of the legend: invisibility. While the USS Eldridge's disappearance remains firmly in the realm of myth, the science of cloaking has made staggering leaps. Researchers at Duke University successfully hid a small object from microwaves in 2006 using metamaterials engineered structures that bend light around an object like water flowing around a rock. The catch: this only works for specific wavelengths, not the full spectrum of visible light. Even today's most advanced invisibility cloaks are more like high-tech camouflage, effective only under precise laboratory conditions. Scaling this up to a warship would require materials that don't exist and energy levels comparable to a nuclear reactor. Then there's the matter of teleportation, another pillar of the Eldridge's legend. Quantum physicists have indeed teleported particles specifically, the quantum states of photons across distances up to 800 miles. But here's the reality check. This isn't Star Trek-style beaming. Quantum teleportation transfers information, not matter, and only works for subatomic particles in carefully controlled environments. To teleport something as complex as a human, let alone an entire ship, you'd need to map and reconstruct every atom in perfect order, a task so computationally monstrous that even our most powerful supercomputers couldn't handle a single cell, much less a 1,000-ton destroyer. But what about the experiment's most horrifying element, the crew's alleged fusion with the ship? Here, modern biophysics offers a grim insight. High-intensity electromagnetic fields can indeed disrupt cellular structures, as seen in rare accidents with MRI machines. In theory, a field strong enough to warp spacetime might also scramble molecular bonds, potentially sticking organic tissue to metal. But as Dr. Elena Vasquez of MIT's Plasma Science Lab points out, the forces needed to achieve this would liquefy the ship long before blending it with human bodies. In other words, the physics behind the sailors' gruesome fates is technically plausible, but only in a scenario where everyone aboard would have been vaporized instantly. So why do the original claims still crumble under scrutiny? Start with energy. The Eldridge's power systems, even at full capacity, couldn't generate a fraction of the energy required for spacetime manipulation. Compare it to CERN's Large Hadron Collider, which uses enough electricity to power a small city just to accelerate particles to near light speed. The idea that a 1940s warship, armed with vacuum tubes and copper wiring, could achieve something far more ambitious defies the laws of thermodynamics. Then there's control. Even if the Navy somehow harnessed these forces, the experiment's alleged precision, phasing the ship in and out of existence without annihilating it, would require computational power decades ahead of its time. Yet the most damning evidence against recreating the experiment isn't technical, it's historical. Despite decades of military secrecy, no declassified project matches the Eldridge's purported goals. Programs like HARP, which studied ionospheric manipulation, or even the Manhattan Project, operated on scales that left paper trails. If the Philadelphia experiment had even a shred of validity, its budget, personnel, or aftermath would have leaked conclusively by now. Instead, we're left with a story that morphs with each retelling, adapting like a virus to resist scrutiny. That hasn't stopped true believers from trying. In 2017, a group of independent researchers crowdfunded an attempt to recreate the experiment's conditions using portable Tesla coils and a decommissioned fishing vessel. The result, a brief flicker in local radio signals and a lot of scorched equipment. The team's leader later admitted, "We proved you can't bend reality with eBay parts and a car battery." Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy's own 2021 patent for a space-time modification weapon sparked fresh conspiracy theories until physicists debunked it as speculative paperwork with no working prototype. The Philadelphia experiment endures not because it's scientifically sound, but because it taps into a timeless fear. That science, unchecked, might one day peel back the veil of reality too far. Today's labs can bend light, teleport quantum states, and warp magnetic fields in ways that would have seemed like sorcery 80 years ago. But the gap between what's possible in theory and what's survivable in practice remains as wide as ever. The Eldridge's story is a warning etched in ghostly green haze, a reminder that some doors, once opened, might not lead anywhere we'd want to go. One of the most haunting aspects of the Philadelphia experiment isn't just the mystery itself, it's the way the legend has taken root in the minds of those who believe, twisting lives with the same unseen force the Eldridge's crew supposedly faced. Take Richard Masterson, a retired electrician from Ohio who spent 36 years compiling what he called the true history of the experiment in a basement lined with yellowed newspapers and hand-drawn schematics. His family described how he'd trace the same newspaper clippings about the Eldridge every night, muttering about suppressed frequencies and shadow dimensions. By the time he passed away in 2019, his archives contained over 12,000 pages of notes, yet not a single verifiable fact the Navy hadn't already declassified. Masterson's obsession wasn't unique. Psychologists who have studied believers of the Philadelphia experiment note a pattern. Many are highly intelligent, technically skilled individuals whose fascination curdles into fixation, often triggered by personal trauma. One woman whose father served at the Philadelphia Naval Yard in the 1950s became convinced his sudden death from cancer was tied to residual, dimensional radiation from the experiment despite medical records showing routine asbestos exposure. Then there are the emotional legacies passed down like heirlooms. In 2015, a man named Daniel Pearsall launched a viral crowdfunding campaign to exhume his grandfather's body, claiming the deceased sailor had been part of the Eldridge's crew and deserved a proper burial in our dimension. Pearsall's evidence, a single faded photo of his grandfather standing near a ship that bore a vague resemblance to the Eldridge, and a childhood memory of the man screaming in his sleep about green fire. When genealogists proved his grandfather had served on a different ship entirely, Pearsall didn't back down. He argued the Navy had altered the records. This refusal to accept contradictory evidence is textbook cognitive dissonance, yet it underscores the emotional grip the story holds. For descendants like Pearsall, the legend isn't just a conspiracy, it's family lore, a way to make sense of inherited pain. The psychological toll extends beyond individuals to entire communities. In the small Pennsylvania town of New Hope, just miles from the alleged experiment site, an annual Eldridge Symposium draws hundreds who trade stories of time slips and ghost sailors. Local therapists report patients describing panic attacks near the old shipyard, convinced they're sensing residual energy. One woman claimed she could hear phantom screams whenever fog rolled off the Delaware River, a phenomenon psychologists attribute to auditory pareidolia, where the brain imposes meaning on random noise. Yet the more fascinating aspect isn't the hallucinations themselves, but why people latch onto this particular narrative. Dr. Leela Chen, a cultural anthropologist, argues the Philadelphia experiment resonates because it mirrors modern anxieties about technology outpacing morality. It's a Frankenstein myth for the quantum age, she explains. People see AI, genetic engineering, and think if they'd risk tearing reality apart in the 1940s, what are they doing now? The legend becomes a vessel for existential dread. Even those who don't fully believe find themselves caught in the story's gravity. Mark Rourke, a former naval engineer, set out in 2020 to debunk the experiment once and for all, only to uncover odd discrepancies in degaussing equipment logs from 1943. Though he concluded the anomalies were wartime record-keeping errors, he admitted the research left him uneasy. You start noticing how many documents are missing, how many witnesses clammed up, he said. After a while, you realize it's not about whether the experiment happened. It's about why we need to think it did. This duality skepticism entwined with lingering doubt fuels the legend's endurance. The Philadelphia experiment isn't just a story about a ship. For those who fall under its spell, it becomes a mirror reflecting their deepest fears about power, secrecy, and the fragility of reality itself. And in that space between fact and folklore, the real experiment continues not on the decks of a warship, but in the minds of those who dare to wonder. The Philadelphia experiment isn't just a ghost story about a vanishing ship. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when secrecy collides with human curiosity. At its core, the legend exposes the dangers of unchecked government opacity, how the absence of transparency doesn't just hide the truth, it breeds something far more volatile: myth. When institutions bury their failures or ambitions behind classified stamps and shredded documents, they don't erase history. They invite speculation, conspiracy, and an erosion of public trust that can linger for generations. Consider the Manhattan Project. The atomic bomb was developed in utter secrecy, yet once revealed, its science was scrutinized, debated, and ultimately understood. But when secrets remain unresolved, like the Eldridge's alleged disappearance, they fester, mutate, and take on a life of their own. The Navy's stonewalling didn't kill the Philadelphia experiment, it gave it immortality. What makes unsolved mysteries like this so irresistible? There's a primal allure to the gaps in our understanding, spaces where science hasn't yet planted its flag. The Eldridge's story thrives in that liminal space between the possible and the impossible, where quantum physics brushes up against the supernatural. We're wired to seek patterns, to stitch chaos into narrative, even when that narrative bends reality. The experiment's enduring appeal lies in its ambiguity. It's not a UFO sighting with blurry photos or a cryptid tale with shaky footprints. It's anchored in real places, real ships, real scientists, just distorted enough by time and trauma to feel tantalizingly plausible. This is why the story resurfaces with every new technological leap. It's a mirror for our collective anxiety about progress. When AI starts writing poetry or quantum computers crack unbreakable codes, the Eldridge whispers, but at what cost? Science's relationship with the paranormal is equally revealing. The Philadelphia experiment forces researchers to walk a tightrope, dismissing outright hoaxes while remaining open to anomalies that might reshape understanding. Look at how mainstream physics once ridiculed quantum entanglement as spooky action at a distance, only to later embrace it as fundamental law. The Eldridge's alleged teleportation remains impossible by today's standards, but the underlying curiosity about manipulating spacetime. That's now cutting-edge research. CERN Large Hadron Collider and DARPA quantum experiments prove reality is stranger than we imagined. The lesson here isn't that every myth holds truth, but that dogmatic skepticism can blind us to the next frontier. As astronomer Carl Sagan put it, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but the door must stay slightly ajar, lest we mistake the limits of our knowledge for the limits of the universe. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Philadelphia experiment is how it exposes the human cost of the unknown. The sailors allegedly fused into bulkheads or driven mad aren't just plot devices. They're reminders of the flesh and blood consequences when ambition outpaces ethics. This isn't unique to World War II. From Tuskegee's syphilis studies to Cold War radiation tests, history is littered with tragedies where people became collateral damage in the name of progress. The Eldridge myth amplifies this fear into the realm of science fiction, but its emotional core is painfully real. When institutions prioritize breakthroughs over humanity, the results are rarely heroic. They're horrific, yet there's an unexpected beauty in the experiment's persistence. It's proof that even in an age of satellites and smartphones, mystery still thrums beneath the surface of our logic-driven world. The story endures not because it's true, but because it could be, and that sliver of doubt is where wonder lives. In chasing shadows like the Eldridge, we're not just searching for answers. We're grappling with the vast, unsettling thrill of all we don't yet understand. The Philadelphia experiment's greatest lesson might be this: some secrets aren't meant to stay hidden. They're meant to keep us questioning, probing, and marveling at the edges of the impossible, because sometimes the unknown isn't a warning, it's an invitation. Despite decades of investigation, the Philadelphia experiment remains riddled with gaps that refuse to be filled, puzzles so persistent they've become part of the legend itself. The first and most haunting mystery revolves around the crew. Nearly 80 years later, we still don't know what happened to at least 15 sailors listed on the Eldridge's October 1943 roster. Their service records end abruptly with no discharge papers, death certificates, or pension files. Families of some crew members insist their relatives returned, changed men who aged decades overnight, spoke of falling between worlds, or vanished without explanation years later. One granddaughter shared letters from her grandfather, a gunner's mate, describing nightmares where his hands would pass through solid objects. He was found dead in his garage in 1951, his wrists fused to the steering wheel of his car, an incident ruled spontaneous combustion despite no burn marks on his clothes. The Navy's explanation, a boiler malfunction, but no boiler existed in that garage. Then there's the paper trail, or lack of it. While the Eldridge's deck logs from October 1943 were lost, researchers digging through adjacent archives found something peculiar. Weather reports from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard that month note an anomalous energy surge strong enough to knock out compasses for 3 miles. A civilian electrician's work order, preserved in a private collection, mentions repairing high-voltage coils on D-173. The Eldridge's hull numbered days before the alleged experiment, coils not part of standard degaussing systems. Most damning, a 1944 memo from the Office of Naval Intelligence instructing personnel to avoid discussion of optical refraction tests with outsiders. These fragments don't prove a ship vanished, but they paint a picture of something unusual happening, something the Navy took pains to obscure. The most chilling unanswered question isn't about documents or disappearances, it's about the anomalies that continue to surface. Visitors to the old Philadelphia Naval Shipyard report fleeting malfunctions, cameras failing, compasses spinning wildly near Dock 3 where the Eldridge was moored. In 1992, a construction crew excavating the site uncovered a section of steel bulkhead embedded with what appeared to be human teeth and bone fragments. The Navy swiftly confiscated the findings, labeling them hazardous materials. Even modern scientists can't dismiss every account. Dr. Aaron Feldman, a materials physicist, analyzed a rusted bolt from the Eldridge's sister ship in 2018. Its molecular structure showed strange layering, as if subjected to rapid, extreme time dilation, a phenomenon he admitted shouldn't be possible with known physics. What keeps these mysteries alive isn't just the lack of answers, it's what they imply about our understanding of reality. If even one sailor's account of phasing through walls holds a grain of truth, it suggests gaps in our grasp of quantum mechanics. If those weather reports hint at an energy pulse beyond 1940s technology, what else might governments have discovered and buried? The Philadelphia experiment forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility that our scientific certainties might be fences built around vast unknowns. Every generation assumes it's unraveled the universe's secrets, only for the next to discover how much lies beyond the fence. The Eldridge's lingering mysteries aren't just about a ship. They're about the boundaries of human knowledge and the unsettling thought that those boundaries might be far flimsier than we dare admit. Decades of research, speculation, and debate have whittled the Philadelphia experiment down to 2 paradoxical truths. It almost certainly never happened as described, and yet, in some strange way, it refuses to disappear. The facts are clear enough. No declassified documents confirm teleportation or invisibility tests. The USS Eldridge's logs place it elsewhere during the alleged incident, and the story's most vocal witness, Carlos Allende, spun tales thicker than fog. Yet the myth persists, evolving with each generation, because buried within the fiction are just enough unsettling truths to keep doubt alive. The Navy was experimenting with electromagnetic camouflage during World War II. Sailors did suffer bizarre injuries from high-energy field tests, and governments have erased inconvenient histories before. The Philadelphia experiment isn't just a story about a ship, it's a Rorschach test for our deepest anxieties about power, secrecy, and the price of progress. What makes this tale so endlessly compelling isn't the question of whether a destroyer vanished in 1943, it's why we need to believe it might have. The legend taps into something primal, the fear that science, unchecked, could unravel reality itself. Every technological leap from atomic bombs to AI renews the parable's urgency. What if they're playing with forces they don't understand? The experiment also mirrors our uneasy relationship with institutions. In an age of MK Ultra and Snowden leaks, the idea that a government would risk lives for a wartime advantage feels less like conspiracy and more like historical precedent. The Eldridge's crew, whether real or imagined, became proxies for every whistleblower, every forgotten victim of clandestine research. And then there's the mystery's DNA, its uncanny ability to mutate. Like Schrödinger's cat, the Philadelphia experiment exists in a quantum state, both debunked and irrefutable. Scientists can calculate the impossibility of teleporting a ship, yet can't explain why bulkheads from the era show odd molecular fractures. Historians can trace Allende's hoaxes, but not account for missing crew manifests or redacted medical files. The closer you look, the more the story fractures into a hall of mirrors, where every answer births 10 new questions. So here's the real enigma. If the Philadelphia experiment didn't happen, why won't the story die? Maybe because some legends aren't meant to be solved. They're cautionary tales, warnings etched in collective memory. Or perhaps the truth is even stranger, that myths like matter can't be created or destroyed, only transformed. Whatever the case, the experiment's legacy endures, not in classified files or faded photos, but in the stubborn human instinct to peer beyond the edges of the known. What do you think really happened? Was there a kernel of truth buried under decades of exaggeration? Or is the myth itself the experiment, a test of how easily reality bends under the weight of our imagination? Drop your theories below and don't forget to subscribe, because history's greatest mysteries aren't in the past, they're waiting in the shadows just beyond the next click.